So, one of the tricky things about giving detailed screenwriting feedback from the producer's perspective is that for any given script, there are literally hundreds of different things you could talk about, and you can't possibly talk about all of them. So, my hope going forward is that I don't always land on that one thing that puts my foot squarely in my mouth. Hello, my screenwriting friends, and welcome to another episode of The Feedback Loop. This is the free weekly series where we take a look at the first 3 pages of a different writer's script each week, and I review them for you from the producer's perspective. Now, we're going to go through them word by word, page by page, and we're going to try to identify what's working in those screenplays and what's maybe not working in those screenplays. And then if something's not working, we have the writer on the call with us so we can discuss what their ideas, their motivations, their thoughts were. See if we can't find a way to make those pages connect with the reader a little bit more effectively, or at least give them some ideas for how to approach the rewrite itself. Now, if you don't know me, you've never heard of me before, my name is Jeff Ballo. I have spent nearly 20 years as a frustrated independent producer who was searching for material to produce. When I couldn't find anything viable, I started trying to teach screenwriting from the producer's perspective because I met a lot of writers along the way who have great ideas, but they aren't necessarily able to make those ideas appear on the page in a way that is viable and that resonates with a producer searching for material. So I've been a little sidetracked down that path, and my hope is that with this series, we can start to connect some of those dots. If you come back week after week after week, you'll start to see patterns. You'll start to see how something that I can explain to you intellectually, you'll gradually start to understand viscerally. And that's kind of the goal of this series. When we're finished with today's writer's pages, we're also going to then review the first 3 pages of a famous story. So today, we're going to look at the first 3 pages from the Oscar-nominated screenplay for 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. There are some connections with that story and today's pages, and it really does start strong in a simple, dramatic way without sort of containing that hook in that initial in those initial pages. So it's a great example of how to really start off strong with your screenplay. So hopefully that will be helpful, insightful, and a lot of fun. Now, today's pages come to us from a writer out of Massachusetts in the United States, a guy named Paul Mintzer. Paul has written a screenplay called Werner and Friedrich, or Werner and Friedrich. We'll ask him which one it is. This is a period drama, or a historical drama, a war drama, maybe just a drama. And Paul is on the call with us, so we can have an interesting and lively discussion with Paul. Now, keep in mind, these sessions are, in fact, a deep dive, so settle in, enjoy. I initially was going to edit these episodes down to just sort of get tight and concise, but I think it's possibly helpful for you to watch my wheels turn as I'm trying to figure out how to put it into words, because I think if you pay close enough attention, I think you'll start to see the rationale behind the point of view. So that's something that's hard to teach and hard to sort of encapsulate in words. So if you have any questions at any point along the way, pop them into the chat box, into the comments box at the bottom of YouTube here, and I'll go ahead and come back on and answer as many questions as I can. If you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. But for now, settle in and enjoy this episode of The Feedback Loop. Fade in, exterior Austria, Rietz River Valley day. Super, Fulpmes, Austria, early summer 1942. A passenger train parallels the river as it approaches the small resort town of Fulpmes. The valley floor is in technicolor bloom. Snow-capped peaks frame the scene. Exterior Fulpmes, Austria, day. Nazi flags hang from lampposts and public buildings. A church bell peals in the distance. Interior St. Vitus Parish Church, day. Bach's Jesu, joy of man's desiring, echoes from the church's simple stucco walls. Interior St. Vitus Parish Church, organ loft, day. Werner Hartmann, 17, clean scrubbed, boy next door handsome, sits next to Herr Sachs, 65, the white-haired church organist. Herr Sachs nods. Werner turns the page. The final notes reverberate, then fade. Werner, I can't explain it, Herr Sachs. This music just gets to me, right here. Herr Sachs, I understand perfectly, Werner. Herr Sachs glances down at the pews below. Herr Sachs continued. I believe your friend Friedrich's looking for you. Werner, hey, Friedrich. He waves. Friedrich, 17, blonde, well-built, seductively handsome, cups his hands to his mouth. Friedrich, meet me after, by the old school. Werner gives him a thumbs up. Exterior in front of the old school, day. Friedrich's feet dangle from an ancient oak. Werner approaches with a soccer ball. He kicks the ball up to Friedrich in a long, graceful arc. Friedrich snares it, jumps down from the tree. Werner, I thought you were spending the day with Lisa. Friedrich, I don't want to seem too eager. We're this close to doing it. Werner, in your dreams, maybe. Friedrich, in my dreams, we've already done it. Werner, I know all about that. We do share a room, after all. Friedrich, joking. You've been spying on me, you little pervert. Werner, I'm the pervert. Look who's talking. Friedrich laughs. Friedrich, so what shall we do? Werner, you know me. I'll always go swimming. Werner, although I think this is supposed to be Friedrich. Oh, Werner, give it up, will you? No one can cross the Reeds in a single breath, not even you. Werner, God gave me these lungs for something. Friedrich, yeah, talking too much. Werner, just for that we're going to climb to the highest ridge, I think. Friedrich sighs. Werner continued. Don't worry, I'll take it nice and slow. Friedrich, why you little. Friedrich chases Werner around the square. They grapple, fall. Friedrich twists Werner's arms behind his back. Friedrich continued. You give? Werner shakes his head. Friedrich tickles him. Okay, I give, says Werner. Exterior mountain meadow above Fulpmes, day. The boys sunbathe just below the ridgeline. Friedrich chews on a blade of grass. Werner reads from an old battered book. Werner, you've got to listen to this. Quote, for one human being to love another, that is perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks, the ultimate, the last test and proof, the work for which all other work is but preparation. Friedrich, let me guess. Rilke again. Werner, who else? So what do you think? Friedrich, it's interesting. No, really, it is. A train whistle echoes up the mountainside. Friedrich, 5:15 already. We better get going. We have a patrol at 6. The drone of failing aircraft engines rises in the distance. Okay, so these are the pages that we're going to look at today. We're going to discuss. I'll sort of put them up here so you can have another look at them. Let me bring Paul onto unmute here. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Jeff.
How did it sound me reading it? Did I stumble over those pronunciations, the German pronunciations too much? Did I?
I don't think so. I don't speak German myself, so it's hard for me to say.
Okay. Well, that's quite interesting. All right. So how did it feel hearing it read by someone else?
It seemed fine.
Okay.
I don't think I heard anything that I wasn't aware of, other than the fact that it's been proofread 15 times and I still got the wrong character name.
It's one of those things, and I wanted to sort of leave it in there and simply call attention to it because, you can. This is what always happens with writing and writers. You look over every single word, every single dot, every single punctuation mark, and something big and obvious sort of jumps out at you only after the fact. So this is very common. It's a obvious lesson that we have to be triple careful of that kind of thing. But yeah, don't worry about it too much. But obviously, we want to fix it before we ever send it out to anyone. So. Okay, so the reason I ask is simply because often when I read out pages, people report to me later that just the simple act of being there when someone else is reading it out can sort of change the way they hear it or see it or think about it. Do you think in hearing it or reading along with me, I guess, that there would be anything that you would do differently at this point before I jump into it?
The one piece of dialogue that I didn't know quite how to handle was where Werner asks Friedrich, "What do you think of it?" And he says, "It's interesting." No, really it is. There's obviously a pause in there because Werner is reacting in some way to what he's saying.
Yes.
Do you think it's okay like that, or?
It doesn't come. I don't think it comes across the way that you want it to. It seems a little stumbly, but I want to talk about the dialogue in general in a moment. So I'll call attention to that as well. But overall, so let me give you a sense of what my first impressions are of the story, of the pages themselves. So overall, one of the things that I really like about it is this very first paragraph. It really paints a quick, succinct picture and pulls us into this story. This is something that so few scripts do, surprisingly enough. Personally, I would probably put this in all caps, the Nazi flags, just so that so that when we're skimming, we're not going to miss the Nazi flags part of it. Yeah, we could gather it from Austria 1942, but Nazi flags is something that we really want, that really will set the stage for us. So it's there, but I think we want to make sure that we always have to be aware that the reader who's reading the pages is potentially skimming, potentially reading really quickly. And we want to make sure they don't miss any of those specific details. But you've really established the setting really nice. I love a church bell peals in the distance. It's such a perfect word, peals in the distance. It creates the image while at the same time describing precisely what it is that's happening. Now, one of the challenges that I think are in these first pages is that we don't really get a sense of. This is a very soft opening, right? So since we know that we're in Nazi-era Austria, 1942, we know that there's sort of this looming sense of the world's about to change, right? So we do get the sense that this is the innocence of youth and these two friends and maybe sort of happy, lazy school days kind of friendship establishment, but we're not really getting a sense of anything happening. Now, because there is that looming sense of the Nazis and this sort of thing, there is a little bit of tension naturally that you've put in there, which is very nice. My challenge with the pages is that if you're trying to establish the friendship, or you're trying to establish maybe childhood, or you're trying to establish this milieu, this environment, this setting, as it were, I still think we're going to need a little something more to pull us into these characters. Let me point out to you the way you've introduced them. So we have Werner Hartmann, 17, clean scrubbed, boy next door, handsome. Then you have Friedrich, 17, blonde, well-built, seductively handsome. All you've really described for these two characters is that they're both handsome, which is okay, but really they're indistinguishable from one another, right? So it's almost like a missed opportunity. We could take that introduction and we could give them a little bit something more. We could give them something a little distinctive that's going to help us understand who each of them is more readily. Do you know what I mean by that?
I think I do.
Okay.
I must say, I found these 3 pages the most difficult in the whole screenplay.
Because
probably for the reasons you're talking about.
Your plot is probably all in the rest of the story, right?
Right.
Yeah. So
Once the plane comes on at the end of the third page, then the action starts.
Yeah. So, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about Three Billboards afterwards, because the first 3 pages in Three Billboards, the action, the hook doesn't actually happen until a couple pages later as well. So, but yet we're drawn into it. So which we are here as well. I want to emphasize that I quite like this as a potential setup. I don't have any problem with what's being written here or the scene itself. The challenge that I have is that there are two major challenges that I have with it. One is the dialogue doesn't feel authentic to me. It doesn't feel like real dialogue from these two boys. Now, I know we are talking about a different era, so I know that the way they interact may ultimately be and feel a little different to one another. But if they're roommates and they're frankly overhearing each other masturbate or whatever, right? There's probably going to be a little more, it's not going to be quite as G-rated, I guess, the way they're talking to each other. Do you know what I mean?
I think so, yes.
Okay, so it's sort of like, I can go through some specifics if we want to, but so we start off in the church choir with the organ, with the organist. They're playing music. The friend comes in. He says, "Meet me after school." Is there anything more that we could add to this? Do you know what I mean? I don't know the whole story. So the challenge that I always have is I'm trying to give you just the generic sense of what my reaction is going to be on first read. So I asked you what your log line was. Can you remind me what it was?
Let's see if I can do it verbatim. But essentially, Werner Hartmann, a young draftee into the SS in the Warsaw Ghetto, falls in love with a Jewish violinist and risks everything to save his life. Essentially, that's what it is.
So the drama that's going to unfold is one of them is going to be I guess apprehended or pulled into the camps and that sort of thing, right?
They're both are going to be drafted in a few pages and sent almost immediately off to patrol the Warsaw Ghetto. They're policemen in training in Fulpness, and this comes out, and that's why they've been picked to do this.
So I wonder if so what's the dynamic between the two characters? What's the so they fall in love? Is it romantic love or is it just friendship love? Like what's the
Friedrich is not the violinist. Friedrich just his friend.
Right.
Werner is going to fall in love with someone who hasn't even appeared yet.
Oh, I see. Okay.
He's not going to meet him until he gets to Warsaw.
Okay. So because your title is Werner and Friedrich, so every word you write, right, puts an idea into the reader's head. So the fact that your title is Werner and Friedrich, and then your log line is presumably that. So if I've read your log line or you've submitted your log line, there's going to be that assumption that that's what it is, right? So when we meet them here and they're frolicking, right, as kids do, right? It's not necessarily physical attraction scene going on. It might just be innocent high school playing around, whatever it is, right? So, but within the context of knowing what the title is and knowing maybe what the log line is, the assumption may become that, right? So. Not necessarily a problem, but if you know that, you as the writer can perhaps play with that a little bit, or sort of take the reader almost like a red herring down a different path, and then no, it's something else, and no, their friendship has expanded out. And do you understand what I'm saying? Like there are many ways to go about doing that, but that first reaction from the reader will be that based upon those details. Does it make sense?
Right.
So
Yes.
my point being that when I'm reading these pages, that's the thought that's sort of going through my head. Okay, this is going to be the seeds of this relationship between these two boys, right? So if that's not what your intention is, or if that's not,
No.
or if that may distract me from what you really want me to be interpreting and seeing and thinking here, then we have to be aware that that's what that reaction could be based on that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Essentially, in this screenplay, Werner is the hero,
Okay.
and Friedrich is the protagonist because he's the one that changes.
Okay.
And Ephraim, who's the violinist, plays a more secondary role. And it's how that relationship affects them, Werner and Friedrich.
So it's
sort of the
how,
heart
so
of the story.
Friedrich is the one that's going to have the relationship with Ephraim?
No, Werner is.
Werner is, and Werner's the hero of the story, right?
Yes, but not the protagonist.
So he's not the hero specifically. He is he's the main character. He's the character
Main character, okay.
whose eyes we experience the story through.
Mhm.
Right. Okay. So and so the relationship that he has with Ephraim is what affects Friedrich and the relationship between Friedrich and Werner. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what we're trying to do, what's the objective here in this initial scene then? To establish the relationship between these two?
Well, that and just to set up a very tranquil, pastoral sort of scene, which is then going to, at the end of page 3, beginning of page 4, get broken by these airship battle.
Right. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. I think you're setting up the pastoral scene nicely. I think the challenge is though, because firstly, there's this presumption of what we're reading here, this presumption that maybe this is a relationship going on here. So we're thinking, oh, okay, they're talking about, I wanted to go with Lisa, I've already dreamt about that, blah, blah, blah. Because of what's in our head already based on the title and based on your log line, we're seeing this as, oh, they're not aware yet of their own sexuality. Do you see what I mean? So it has a different subtext to it, simply because of what the readers bring in based on.
I didn't intend that at all.
Okay, so if not, then that's fine, but we have to then be careful about moments that could be interpreted that way or that could be seen that way. Do you see what I mean? Like if you, so you mentioned here that he tickles him. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that, or even that sends that into thinking this way or that way. It's simply, it's all about context, right? It's all about what details do we know going into it, and then what do those the reader is always going to imagine ahead of your story. From the title to the log line to the specific script pages themselves. We're always going to be imagining ahead where we think the story's going. And we're going to try to get ahead of you, the writer. So you have to, as the writer, know that so that you can make sure that if we're going down this direction, or because I've written this, they're going to think that. Well, now we can spin that. Now we can say, you thought of this. Well, now this is happening instead, right? That's not specifically what your target is here, because you're just trying to set up the tranquil scene. You're trying to set up the relationship.
Well, an awful lot of there's a lot of things that are in these pages that are setting up things that are going to happen long afterwards.
Such as, for example?
Werner's ability to hold his breath.
Okay.
Because later on, someone is going to try to drown him and think they've succeeded, but not because of this ability.
But now, do we go, or is there a scene here before the battle comes in that where we see him holding his breath, or only that he's talked about it here?
Friedrich's talking. He said, I'll go swimming. Friedrich says, you can't try to get across this river on one breath. God gave me these lungs for something. Yeah, talking too much.
Well, so the challenge is when this kind of setup happens through dialogue. Later on, we're not going to remember it, and it won't. Here's the challenge. Imagine that we went out and we filmed the movie, and this dialogue wasn't in there, and we realized later on, hey, he holds his breath, and that's sort of really unrealistic that somebody could hold their breath for 5 minutes or whatever it is. We need to set that up somehow. How are we going to set that up? We'll go back and we'll add it as voiceover, right? We'll go back and add it as a dialogue exchange. Does that make sense? Like it's a almost cheat way of setting something up.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be reinforced later on before that scene happens.
Okay.
I'll talk about it more.
Okay, fair enough. But I wonder if it would be possible to set this at the river rather than just as a rather than, you know, like where we're in that more, where that's part of the action. Because a lot of what's happening here is it's just sort of, it feels like when you're reading it for the first time, it feels like throwaway dialogue. It feels like it's not bad for throwaway dialogue. Don't get me wrong. Like each line is adding more information, and that's good. It's a little on the nose. Like it's a little, these don't feel like people talking so much. They feel like characters talking, if that makes if that distinction makes sense to you. What I would like to see is maybe a rewrite here where the dialogue itself is maybe a little more clipped, where it's, you know how when people talk to each other, they'll interrupt each other or they'll finish each other's thoughts, or there's more back and forth. You have a little bit of it with, you know, in your dreams, maybe in my dreams, we've already done it. When you have a line like this, I know all about that. We do share a room after all. Two people don't say that. This is a perfect example of a character speaking exposition for the sake of an audience.
Right.
So the audience needs to know that they're roommates. So don't say we do share a room after all. Like two people aren't going to say that to each other. What they would say is something like, you know, so keep to your side of the room, or I don't know. So, add another layer to it. So when you're revealing that information, as we read it, there's no way to read it without understanding that they're roommates. But what's within the line of dialogue is the way roommates would talk to each other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's precisely the kind of line that makes the dialogue feel a little stilted or a little bit unrealistic. And when it does, the effect that it has on the reader is that it makes it hard to care about the characters. So, so what's going to happen is in the subsequent scenes, we're not going to have that emotional connection that we'll need to have for the attack to work, for the attack may still work, and based on your writing style, I think you probably have written it very nicely. But if it's like special effects, it's like if we don't care about the characters, it doesn't matter how nice the visual effects are, right? So, and you have this opportunity here. You have these first 3 pages, which are really setting up these characters. So what I would suggest to you is to think about what needs to happen later in your story. And think about not just plot, not just he needs to hold his breath for 5 minutes. So how do I show that? Although I do think you should try to, if you can show that here, that's going to be more effective. Again, not knowing what's in the rest of your script, so you may have set it up perfectly fine elsewhere. I'm just in principle, right? But the other thing that you can try to do is think thematically. So think about what issues your characters are going to be facing or going through. What challenges are going to come up later in the story? What are you going to try to like tease out of this relationship to help us understand human beings and human relationships and human nature? And then find the thing that you're trying to express and then show the counterpoint here, or show it here, perhaps, right? So it's not just about setting up this idyllic little setting that's about to get torn apart. It's really about we see maybe Friedrich is always sort of lovelorn, or always we see that he's a deep thinker through his or Werner's the deep thinker because he's looking at this quote. When you struggle with a line like "it's interesting, no, really, it is," what you're trying to say is you're trying to show his reaction to this, right?
Right.
And what is it that you want to say?
That he really isn't interested in it, but he doesn't want to hurt Werner's feelings.
Okay, so what you're probably going to want to try to do is what may help is looking at another part of your story where is there a part of your story where Friedrich's disinterest affects Werner in some profound way?
Disinterest.
Well, or lack of. My point is, if you can find something later on in the story where what you're trying to show and highlight within their relationship is well expressed, or it's an example of how it falls apart, something in the extreme, you can think of this as almost like a foreshadowing of that, right? So you could think of finding a way to hint at where this relationship might break down, or the opposite, right? Where the thing that's going to be the bond. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Am I being clear?
I think the solution may be to take those 2 lines of dialogue just out.
Possibly, but if you're trying to show something specifically, I don't think I don't know.
Well, what I'm interested in is the quote, which is one of Rilke's most famous quotes. And it sets up the sort of romantic, in the literary sense, romantic sensibilities of Werner, as opposed to Friedrich, who's much more down to earth.
Okay.
And Werner has his head up in the clouds. And he doesn't change, where he starts is almost where he ends. But Friedrich does as a result.
So Werner starts with his head in the clouds and ends, or Friedrich starts with his head down to earth and ends a bit more elevated than that?
I think so, yes.
So if that's the case, then what I would probably say is you're going to want a real, maybe even mocking kind of line, like something that really shows this character as being a feet on the ground sort of guy. Right. So that way you have the counterpoint, so we can see in order to show any character change over the course of your story, we're going to need to demonstrate in some way that they're one way at the beginning and a different way at the end. So right now, this is where the missed opportunity comes, right? Because right now they're just sort of, having a happy utopian frolic prior to the invasion, right? So if within that we also get a real sense of this guy's head's in the clouds, this guy's feet are on the ground, and draw out that counterpoint through the dialogue and the way they handle whatever the situation is, I think that will come across more effectively, and it'll help us be prepared for what's happening later in the story. So we'll start to notice that change. Does that make sense?
Yes. Part of the thing is maybe I'm trying to set up too much in the first few pages.
No, I don't think so. It doesn't feel like an overly. It feels like it's written at the right pace, right? It doesn't feel like too much information. It doesn't feel like too much detail. It feels like what often happens. What I've found along the way is that writers, because you see the story in a lot of detail, knowing which details to put in the script that are going to give us that full picture without overloading us can be a really challenging battle, right? It can be a really difficult thing to find where that balance is. I think the pacing is fine. I think the length of the scenes are fine. I think it's just sort of what's in, it's like the box is fine, but what's happening in the box is a little fluffy, you know? Like it's not, like it feels like it needs to be more, there needs to be a little more gravitas to it. If we've read your log line at this point, we know that there's a war coming. We know that this is going to be about the Warsaw Ghetto. You know, these are some pretty intense topics, right? So, so then to have the first couple of pages not really give us too much, it's going to feel like, okay, like I don't know, the reaction is. The reaction is going to be a bit muted, and we're going to maybe lose the sense that this is going to go where we need it to. Now, I don't want to like negate it too much, because at the end of the day, it's a nice setup, and there's a lot here to really like about it. It's just, to me, as I read it the first time through, I liked the descriptions a lot. I thought the scenes were light on substance, and then the dialogue the dialogue wasn't authentic, and so I didn't feel like I was meeting actual characters. And the challenge is that makes me think that the story that's going to unfold is going to be light and fluffy as well, and not representative of what the story is going to be. So even though these are your initial pages to almost in some way set up everything that gets destroyed, they still we need to know more of why this is such a great thing, or what this relationship is about. Hopefully that makes sense. Does it make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I chose these first pages from this particular screenplay is because these pages are the pages I am the most unhappy with.
Okay.
And very much for the reasons you're saying.
Okay.
But I think you've given me some ideas about how to change that.
Good. I
mean, once you get to page 4, I guarantee you'll be into it.
But so this is the great challenge, right? Because if you send in a script and someone goes, "Hey, this sounds really interesting," and then like the first 3 pages don't grab them, I would tell you, I would probably keep reading this script to about page 10, because based on the strength of what's here at the beginning, I would go, I'll give it till page 10, or maybe a little further depending on what happens in the first 10 pages. But if we have, sort of 2 or 3 more pages of not a whole lot happening, the challenge is that at this point, from the producer's perspective, you already know there is maybe not insubstantial development required, right? I'm going to have to put more time and energy into getting this to where it needs to be. This is not a ready to go production. So that's going to knock you down in the producer's estimation, simply because I can't go out and do anything with this right now. Right? So if they're in love with your log line, they're in love with your synopsis, they're excited about the project in general, then that may be okay. Because they'll go, I can see how to turn this into something. They'll get excited, they'll go. But for the vast majority, it's probably going to be a little less than that. They're going to go, yeah, this is promising, but too much work. Let's see what else is out there. Make sense? So I want to make sure that you try to avoid that. And I don't think it's too far. I really just think we need more. Just think in terms of what do you need to, what's the journey that's going to happen? What's the change that happens for the characters? We want to really firmly establish at the beginning the starting point, so that as we go through it, we can more firmly demonstrate the change. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Do you have anything else you want to say or talk about before
Well,
we?
maybe instead of them talking about the swimming, as you said, maybe that's where the scene should go. Instead, if the swimming scene, then they have to get up to the mountain because the plane has to fly over them and start shooting at them.
Well, is there a lake up there, or is there, or is there another way to show the holding breath thing? Like, there's no real action happening in the. There's no
Right.
there's nothing they're doing within the scene, right? They're
Right.
sort of talking.
Right.
One of the ways you can always improve your dialogue heavy scenes, is to have them doing something specific within the dialogue scene, so that the dialogue is bouncing off of the action within the scene. So rather than just have two characters talking to each other, just have them doing something and talking to each other, and all of a sudden you add a dynamic. If you then take that action and make it something that's going to evoke their character types or their relationship, that's going to put us in a situation where we will be able to see that, then bang, we're in. You understand?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your pages, by the way. I look forward to what you're doing. If you're interested in having a go at doing another pass, or you want to send them back in, what I want to do with these sessions is in a future episode, come back and have another look at what you've done and see if we can talk through how the changes of, what changes you've done to it, and see if we're sort of incorporating some of that stuff if you're interested in doing that.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. For those of you who are watching and following along, I think some of the takeaways for this really are, firstly, make sure you establish that picture really well. These pages establish that picture very nicely. The hillside is in Technicolor bloom. What was the other one? The snow-capped peaks frame the scene. Three little lines, one 3-little-line paragraph, and we have this picture of where we are. The Nazi flags in the town. Each of the scenes started with a nice, quick little description, and then we're into the scene. It's not overwhelming. We're not over-describing things. That aspect of it is really solid, and that pulls the reader into the story. That's going to be something that that will make the reader want to read further, even if there are these other problems along the way. Right, particularly if there's a strong log line or synopsis, just something drawing us into the story in the first place. The challenge is whenever we have characters that aren't really necessarily doing much, or they're indistinguishable from one another, the challenge becomes that we can't care. Right, when you're introducing the characters, particularly early on, we always want to make sure that we're giving them something that they do, or something that they say, or some action that's happening that we can be drawn into as well. So it doesn't have to be something we like to do, just has to be something that they're actively engaged in. That's always going to it's always going to draw us into a story and into the character more effectively. If I can see who those two characters are right up front, and I would argue in a script called Werner and Friedrich, we're going to want to know who Werner and Friedrich are as early as possible. And they're both in the first couple of pages. So we want to make sure that those characters are clear, so that we know we want to keep reading this page and find out more about these guys. This is an interesting scene setting situation, characters I care about. I'm going to keep reading. Does that make sense? Metin asked, did you also feel that some of the dialogue didn't sound like it from the 1940s of Austria? So if you're writing a story for, let's say, the US market in 2018, 2020, whatever it is, that ultimately is when the movie's going to come out, it doesn't necessarily have to be purely authentic of the era. It has to feel like the era, probably, which is the simplicity of the dialogue between those characters gave us this sense of maybe a more innocent time, and in that way felt dated in that sense. But because the characters were not quite talking to each other the way two characters like that would, using shorthand, using secret language that only the two of them know. They're friends, presumably at this point. So, friends speak in shorthand. Friends tease each other. Friends are going to, they're going to have shared knowledge with each other. So if you can incorporate that into the dialogue, that's actually going to make it feel more authentic than if you make it something specific to that era. Because making it specific to that era, unless it's absolutely necessary for the story, isn't ultimately necessarily going to be required for us to be pulled into and care about and follow and be interested in the story. Does that make sense? So what I'd like to do now is have a look at some pages, the first 3 pages of Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, in part because I noticed that when I read Paul's pages, then you read these other script pages, and you see a similar sort of situation where we're pulling characters in. The main action of the story, just as in Paul's, doesn't happen until a few pages after page 3. So to say that you need to have that big hook or that big inciting incident or that big moment of the story right up front on page 1 or page 3 is not actually the takeaway. What we want to do is we want to pull people into the story. So let me show you, let me talk through, read through, and then discuss the pages of Three Billboards. And hopefully that will make this idea a little clearer as well. Written by Martin McDonough, who was nominated for a Best Original Screenplay Oscar. So, exterior Billboard Road day. Mildred Hayes, a woman in her early 50s, driving along a country road, passes an old billboard, roadside. Whatever advert was on it is long since faded and torn. Mildred drives on to a second billboard a few hundred feet along the road. She notices this one a little more, though its old adverts are equally ramshackle. She slows to a stop. After looking up at the billboard a while, she slowly reverses and stops at the first, then at all 3, stretching away to the quiet horizon. Makes a mental note of ebbing billboard advertising, then drives on again, leaving the 3 old billboards alone like tombstones on the dusty road. Interior Welby's office, Ebbing Advertising, day. Red Welby's office, window looking onto Main Street and the town's police station. Red, a cool-looking young guy, pretends to read a Penguin classic as he observes the office hottie, Pamela, pass in a cute dress. Mildred strides in. Mildred, you read Welby? Red, yes, ma'am. How may I? Mildred, they say those 3 billboards out on Drinkwater Road. You're in charge of renting them out. That right? Red, I didn't know we had any billboards out on, where is Drinkwater Road? Mildred, road out past the Sizemore turnoff no one uses since the highway got put in. Red checks a file. Mildred observes a beetle on its back on the windowsill trying to right itself. Red, you're right, got 3 billboards out there. Nobody's put nothing up out there since 1986. That was Huggies. Mildred, how much to rent out all 3 of them the year? Red, the year. You want to pay for 3 billboards on a road no one goes down unless they got lost or they're retards for a year? Mildred, quick, ain't you, Welby? Red, well, what I say goes these days at the Ebbing advertising desk. I'm going to strike you a real good deal on those billboards. Now, what was it you said your name was, Mrs. Mildred? What's the law on what you can and can't say on a billboard? I assume it's you can't say nothing defamatory and you can't say fuck, piss, or cunt. That right? Red, taken aback. Or anus. Mildred, well, I think I'll be all right then. Here's $5,000 for the first month. I assume that'll cover it. She plonks down $5,000 cash. Mildred continued, and here's what the billboards ought to say. She hands him 3 index cards, then moves to the window. He reads the first, the second, the third, stunned. Mildred, why don't you draw up a little contract betwixt us while you're at it? Make sure no one rents them billboards out from under me. Welby looks up at her sadly. I guess you're Angela Hayes' mother. Mildred, that's right. I'm Angela Hayes' mother. Mildred at the window gently sets the beetle back upright. It waddles off happily. Behind it, the U.S. flag flutters above the police station as a couple of laughing cops enter it. Mildred, name's Mildred. How long before you've got him up? Red, checking calendar. Oh, shall we say Easter Sunday? Mildred stares out at the police station. Mildred, that'd be perfect. Exterior cop car driving Billboard Road, night. Officer Dixon, 35, drives up the billboard road and approaches from behind the third billboard. 2 Latino workmen on it, buckets and squeegees. As he passes, he looks up at the posters on it, double takes, screeches to a halt. The billboard reads in large, stark letters, "How come, Chief Willoughby?" Dixon, "Hey, what the hell's this?" Latino, "Que?" Dixon, "How come Chief Willoughby what?" Latino, "What?" Dixon, "Yeah." Latino, "Huh?" Dixon, "How come what?" Latino, "What?" Dixon, "Listen, I better start getting some straight answers out of you Mexican sons of bitches." The second Latino is pointed to the distant second billboard, making an odd little gesture, and Dixon looks over. So obviously, we don't know what's on those 3 billboards in the first 3 pages, but we're clearly building to something. So the thing that I wanted to point out with these pages is that even though the inciting incident, as it were, is really not happening yet, that being when Dixon discovers what the third, which is the first billboard, says, because we're introducing them in reverse order. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a fantastic film. You definitely should see it. I believe it's a very, very strong film. As a character film, as something that pulls us into the story, there is drama within the story that helps us understand who these characters are. It really shows us the interpersonal relationships between these people in the story. We get that from these first 3 pages. From the very first page, she sees the billboards. We don't know what she's thinking, but we know she's thinking something. She immediately goes to the advertising company, which is right there overlooking the police station, which is emphasized in the story. She plunks down cash. When she gives the guy the index cards and he reads the index cards, he immediately knows who she is. Something dramatic has happened here. Something dramatic has happened to this woman, to this person. So we have something pulling us into the story. We instantly understand who these 2 characters are. We know Mildred Hayes right away. We understand notice the way they talk. They're not, they don't comment on the way they talk, but you can hear their accent just in the way the words are laid out. You can see the 2 different points of view through, you can see she's no nonsense through just that dialogue itself. We learn the fact that these billboards haven't been used for decades, that they're in disrepair, that there's no way they're probably worth $5,000 a month, but that's what she's paying for them anyway, because she wants them. She wants to say something with them. They have this funny little exchange about what you can't say and the profanity that you can't put on a billboard. But when she hands the index cards over, he says, "I guess you're Angela Hayes' mother." So she says, "That's right, I'm Angela Hayes' mother." No, she doesn't just say yes. She doesn't say, "That's right." She says, "That's right, I'm Angela Hayes' mother." She's really emphasizing what he's saying. So you can use this kind of a technique, you can use this kind of an idea to emphasize and highlight a piece of information, right? Then, once we've done that, we're out there with the cop car, we're out there with Dixon, played fabulously by Sam Rockwell. And we have this scene that's probably, for page 3, this early in a story, to have a bit of a who's on first moment here, seems a little perhaps odd, but think about this. We've seen what is ultimately the third billboard, because we're seeing it from behind, so we're revealing the billboards. How come Chief Willoughby is going to obviously get the cop worked up? And then you have this sort of exchange. It's drawing out the tension. We're seeing that he's got maybe some racist tendencies in him. Don't know, but we're really setting up the situation. We're drawing out the tension of this, and as a result, we're pulling us into what is on that first billboard. And what, I'm not going to spoil it for you in case you haven't seen it, but what is on that first billboard is kind of the crux of the story and the drama of the film. And so the beauty of the screenplay is that it pulls us right into it so that that moment can land, right? So that moment we see that first billboard, wow, we just have that moment with the character. We understand Mildred instantly. We understand the situation instantly, and it brings us right there into the story. So whatever you may have thought about the movie, I know it wasn't everyone's cup of tea. Personally, I loved it. But if you understand that this is how we want to try to pull people in, it's not necessarily about having that one powerful, momentous action scene on page one that grabs us. It really is about putting in almost like morsels, almost like breadcrumbs that are going to draw the reader into the story and the characters and the situation that's at play. Now, I always hesitate in giving examples to writers because often you'll look at an example and then rather than coming up with your own variation on it, you emulate that example, right? And we don't ultimately want to see your emulation of someone else's writing style or their story. So always try to see if you can focus on the concepts underlying what makes something work or what makes something not quite land in exactly the right way. Conceptually, understand that we as screenwriters, you need to paint a picture of the movie. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Screenwriting is cinema on the page. Screenwriting is the cinematic experience for the reader. When we read your script, we're going to read hopefully at a pace of 1 page per minute, which equals 1 minute of screen time. So we experience the cinematic experience as we're reading the story. So it needs to be visual. It needs to be interesting. These need to be characters we want to know more about and we want to follow. So it doesn't take much. It can be a turn of phrase, the way the character says a specific thing. It can be the way the information is doled out on the page or the way the scene unfolds. We want to always think of every scene as an experience for the reader. So what we're thinking at the beginning of a scene through the information that's revealed within the scene may be very different to what we think at the end of the scene. That's going to feel like a full scene, and you're going to want your early scenes, particularly the scenes that are setting the stage and pulling us into the story, you want those to very clearly pull us in and give us that those twists and that experience. Fernando says, about the inciting incident, the closer to the beginning, the better. I'm having problems between setup and inciting incident. All right, so setup, basically there's my theory, my premise, my observation is that everything in your story is either setup or payoff or both. So when a reader's reading your script, every word they read is going to put a picture in their head. It's going to give them an idea of where your story might be going, what your character, what this might mean for your character, what this might mean for the story. They're going to imagine ahead because everything you write is setting something up. Now, if you write a whole story and you don't pay off what you set up in the beginning, that's called a hole. Right? You have holes in your story. If you have a scene later on that pays something off, but you haven't really set it up right. Paul was talking about later in his story, we need the character to hold his breath for 5 minutes or whatever's happening at that point. So we need to, if the character just is able to do that later on and we haven't set that up, it's going to feel inauthentic. So when we pay something off, we need to make sure there's something in there setting that up. Setup and payoff is a dynamic in storytelling. So if you think of everything you write as either setting something up or paying something off, or maybe reinforcing the setup payoff, or maybe paying one thing off while setting something else up, then to me, this is my observation, is that is that is the fundamental underlying dynamic of storytelling. So setups are throughout your story and can be anywhere in your story. In fact, if you think in terms of plot point 1 or plot point 2 or the major act twists and all this kind of stuff, arguably those are payoffs and setups. So the end of act 1, the thing that does that major twist and sends the story in a new direction, is paying off what happened in the lead up to it and then setting up where we're going from here, right? The inciting incident is a specific moment in your story. There's only one in your story. The inciting incident is that moment in your story that sets your story in motion. Without the inciting incident, there would be no movie, okay? So without the inciting incident, the characters would go on their merry way. So let's say your character gets a job promotion, and we see the character at the beginning of your story. They're going through their life. They get a job promotion. Now they're going to be the big boss. But then on the way to work one day, they're in an Uber which gets hit by another car, and they end up meeting someone who introduces them to opens up a whole new storyline. Getting the promotion is not the inciting incident, because if the Uber crash hadn't happened, they would have continued forward on that storyline. Does that make sense? The story itself is what happens out of the inciting incident. So you can think of the inciting incident as the thing that puts the character on a different path than life was naturally going to take them. So if getting the raise or getting the promotion was the thing that opened up this whole other area, that might be the inciting incident for a story like that. Arguably, that's still that character's normal life. Stories in general are about characters in unusual situations. They're in general about something happening to someone. So in general, we're not just going to tell stories about average, everyday, mundane life. We certainly can, but to convey an idea or to express a meaning or to share a perspective on the world, we want to show characters in situations that are outside the norm or outside of their norm. Because think about it this way, a character, in order to convey an idea or a message or a meaning or here's how I think life works, we want to show a character going through some sort of a change. My basic belief is that story is about change. We have a character who starts one way, they go through a series of events, and they end up changed in some way. They're different at the end than they were at the beginning. And it's because they had to go through those various obstacles along the way that they had to grow. They had to overcome those obstacles. They had to become stronger. And that is how the change happens, so that they're ready for that final climax at the end of the story. The inciting incident is that moment in the story, that story element that set the whole thing in motion. Does it make sense? So, yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Arguably, in 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, the inciting incident happens off camera. The inciting incident happens before these pages. If you know the movie, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know the movie, go watch the movie because it's really good. But I don't want to say it because I don't want to spoil it, because I found it to be very, very fascinating. I enjoyed watching it. So I want you to as well if you haven't seen it already. But that thing that set the story in motion happened before this happened. So you could say that when she buys the billboards, that's the inciting incident. That's what sets this whole story in motion itself. It depends on how you perceive it. Depends on what you think your story is. Because in some ways, the story climax, the final battle between whoever the opposing force and your central character is, that final battle at the end, do they triumph or not kind of a moment, is in some ways an answer to that inciting incident. right? So the inciting incident sets the story in motion, go through all this thing, end up with this final conflict. That final conflict is resolved in one way or another, and the characters in their new place at the end. We see them changed in the end. How common is that for the inciting incident to be off screen pre-movie? It depends on the story. There's the example that I learned when I was first learning screenwriting was Kramer versus Kramer, which is an early 70s movie with Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep, and that inciting incident is the divorce, which happens prior to the beginning of the movie. So we see him responding to that situation. We've thrown in there already up the story's going. So there's no right or wrong. I'm gonna say this and emphasize this again and again as time goes on, I'm sure. There is no right or wrong. This is really what it comes down to is, what are you trying to say? What's the story you want to tell your audience, and why do you want to tell that story? What's the point you're trying to make? What's the message you're trying to convey? What's the outcome you want to see in the audience themselves? So based on that, we need to make sure that we build a story that conveys that, because every story is ultimately going to say something, whether we say it consciously and deliberately, or whether we don't care and we just have characters doing things, and then later on we go, oh yeah, that added up to say this, which is the opposite of what I believe, right? Ultimately, every story says something. It's the reason we tell stories. It's the reason we convey. It's the reason we sit around campfires and even, we tell stories to fill the imagination of the other person, to convey an idea, maybe as a parable, maybe as a, here's how you should live in the world. Maybe here's something you haven't thought about. Whatever it is, we're telling our story to say something. So we need to make sure that the elements of the story are conveying that effectively. And we do that through these techniques of story. We do that through, we introduce our character, we send that character on this journey, obstacles get in their way, they have to overcome those obstacles, typically, to convey that. You may have a story or a situation that doesn't fall into that familiar narrative, that doesn't hit the Sid Field page numbers. Not every story has to be shoehorned into those formulaic story models. We can create stories in a virtually infinite array of arrangements, right? We just need to make sure that we tell the story that is going to give the reader the experience that's going to give them the idea or insight or whatever it is that we're trying to give them. Does that make sense? So if you think about nonlinear stories like Pulp Fiction or multi-thread stories like Go or something like that, those stories are not those linear stories, but they're also, as a result, conveying different ideas. They're giving us different thoughts and feelings and responses and perceptions based upon how they are telling us their story. So it's not even necessarily how common something like that is, or if you should or shouldn't do that. We need to understand what you're trying to say. We need to understand what your purpose is with the telling of this story, and then we need to design the story to make sure that it actually has that effect on the reader. Okay, let's see. Shaz says, just a question about action scenes and the use of caps lock facility. Is there an overarching set of rules that need to be adhered to here, or can it vary? Do you have an example from in here? Was there something that you saw in these pages that we talked about? Generally speaking, you're going to use all caps when you introduce a character for the first time. That way, that signals to us that this is a new character. Also, you can you can do something in caps lock when it is something you want to highlight or emphasize, often a sound effect or a piece of information. I had suggested to Paul earlier the Nazi flags. I would have put those in all caps so that when you're skimming down, when the reader's skimming down that page, they're not going to miss that detail. right? They're going to notice the Nazi flags. And then just seeing Nazi flags is going to put that picture in my head. Okay, I know where we are. I know the gravitas of this scene, right? Or if you're reading through a scene and you know, we notice the sample pages that I often use highlight the word microchip, right? Somebody's scurrying through the trash and they find a microchip, and the microchip is in all caps, because we don't want to miss that detail. So it's not so much that there's an overarching set of rules. It's really more a question of, we want to do it sparingly so that if you emphasize everything, nothing is emphasized. So we want to use it sparingly. It's also easier on the eyes to read upper and lowercase. But we do want to have it on things that are emphasized. We do want to have it on when a character is introduced for the first time. Now, one of the things you'll notice in the three billboards script is that the characters appear to be always in all caps in the action description, which I'm noticing now as you drawn my attention to it. Typically speaking, that's not the way it's done. That said, there are lots of rules and ways of doing things that get changed over time. For example, in the script as well, they have the slug lines are all in bold. Typically, that was not the way that it was done, because there was no bold on the old typewriters. That said, when you're reading scripts on a screen, the bold may actually help the eyes, move through that page. We want to make sure that the reader experience is as clean and as effective as possible. I would argue if you have every character's name in all caps throughout your script, depends on how densely your action lines are. That could be very distracting. It depends on how you've written your pages as well. If you're using creative language in the way that you write, you might be able to do that, and it might actually help the eye understand what's going on. So many screenwriters get caught up in the rules of screenwriting, and the rules are only there to make the experience as fluid and effective as possible for the reader and for the production team. What you guys are going to be writing are spec scripts, not shooting scripts. A shooting script is a script that has a lot of input from the director, from the production team, from whatever. And so there are a lot of things in a shooting script that you as a spec script writer are probably not going to generally include. So are the rules different? It's not so much that they're rules. It's about who's going to be reading your script. The people who are reading your script, we want to give them the cinema experience. Anything that gets in the way of that cinema experience by violating the format rules so much that it doesn't even feel like a screenplay anymore, to having every other word in all caps, anything that's going to get in their way is simply going to interrupt their experience of your story. So we just want to know the rules and understand the rules enough to know where we can bend them to effect. Not to say, hey, look at me bending the rules, but to say, here's a picture. Here's a picture more clearly than I could have done it just by following the rules specifically. Is there any way to see examples of successful spec scripts? I don't think I've ever seen one. The script that I want to do next week is one of my favorite spec scripts of all time. It did end up getting made into a movie, so you'll be able to see that as well. I'm just going to tease it here. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but it did start out as a spec script, and I read it years before it got made into a movie and loved it from day one. And I think it's a great example. At the end of the day, it's not. I caution you guys against worrying too much about the other examples. What I think is going to be more helpful and more valuable to you is to understand the principles. So what I want to continue to do with this show is to show you examples from writers' such as you, who are sending in pages that we can look through what you're really doing and how's it landing and how does that work. I think over time, you're going to start to see how things that are missing, things that are chronically missing, things that are done well, how 3 different writers do this thing well. And then if we can sort of counterpoint that with some successful scripts, whether they're spec scripts or whether they're other scripts, I'm going to try to not use shooting scripts wherever possible. I'm going to try to use the reading script wherever possible, so we can get as close as possible to what you're writing or what you would in theory be writing. But if we can just sort of gradually do that over time, I think this becomes clearer. Personally, as I've said to those of you who've been here before, I've read myself somewhere near 7,000 screenplays, and when you do that, when you read enough of them, you just start to see how it works. And the reality is that there's no rule for it. There's no way to say do this, don't do this, because in a different context, this might be the way to do it. So I can't tell you don't do that because, well, it depends on what you're writing, depends on the context of what you're trying to convey. That may be the better way to do it. So this is why I'm a little hesitant to say yes, no, right, wrong. Ultimately, if you can put the movie that you see in your head on the page in such a way that when I read those pages, I see the movie you see, or I see my version, which is a near approximation to the movie you see, then that's a success. And that's what we're going for. And that's hopefully, or over time, going to show you how to do. For those of you who are new to this, if you haven't sent me pages, please send me pages. Submit at thefeedbackloop.co. Send those pages through 3 pages, PDF format. I promise I'll be gentle. I promise I'll help you. I'm not here to make you look bad or to mock or degrade or disparage you in any way. I'm here to help you, hopefully, and see if we're not quite hitting what your target is or what your goal is. And let's see if we can find ways to help you hit that target and hit that goal. And as we go along, I'll probably get more and more concise with the help and specific advice and specific ways to do some of this stuff as well. I'm getting familiar with the format a little bit at the moment. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me this week in this week's session. Have a good week. Make sure to take action every single day. Those of you who are doing fast screenplay, get back in there and do another step every day. Keep moving forward. The only way to learn how to do this stuff, to master the ability to do this stuff, is to actually take action every single day. Don't let the days slip by. Don't postpone or delay. There are so many things that you can focus your energies on. You don't have to do it in order. You don't have to go page 1 through page 100. You can start writing page 60 today if you want to, even though you don't even have the first 60 pages written. You can go in any order. You can do this stuff however you want to do it. The key is to do it, to take action, to follow through, to continue to develop these skills, to understand this really complex yet endlessly fascinating and interesting and fun and enjoyable craft. Because at the end of the day, producers need screenplays. So keep writing yours, and I want to see it turned into a movie at some point soon. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Thanks again to Paul for being brave and sharing your work.